H A dot dash W dot dash dash R dot dash dot O again. Okay, so it really all started out with the electromagnet. And here's an electromagnet which I made earlier. It's very simply a form of stiffish paper, lots and lots of turns of this insulated copper wire, and in the center we have a piece of soft iron. Now it's important that it's soft iron because soft iron loses magnetism straight away. If a piece of steel would possibly retain it. And we find that if we send a current through this coil, it will actually cause a magnetic field. So let's try that by hooking up a battery here, suspending this little electromagnet down here, connecting up some crocodile clips, and now we go.
Boom. Mesmerism.
So as soon as the current flows, this becomes a magnet, and when you cut off the current, it then is no longer a magnet. And the soft iron doesn't retain magnetism.
So tell me, Jackson must have had a voltaic pile in his trunk as well. What did he use for a battery?
He probably had a battery with him, but I'm not sure. Again, reports are kind of very sketchy.
They did when it became legal.
Because don't forget, Jackson and Morse, they went to court.
Yeah.
Denying what had happened on the boat, criticizing each other, changing the story, and so on and so forth. So,
let's just insert it into the story as it is. There are two guys in this ship coming back from Europe. Everyone's, exchanging stories. And there's a Samuel Finley Breeze Morse. And there's a Dr.
Jackson.
Dr. Jackson. And in Dr. Jackson's trunk, he has an
electromagnet.
Which has been invented, if you will, how many years earlier?
It was invented in 1826, I think, about 6 years earlier.
Okay.
6 years earlier. So Jackson produces from his trunk, I presume, something that looks like this, or maybe it may have been a second fork to make a kind of horseshoe type magnet, right?
Sure. How long is the voyage?
The voyage is maybe one to 2 weeks. It depends on the weather.
Okay.
These are sort of sailing, come steam. Bad weather, push them backwards.
So
no wind, they stop. It's all very dependent on the weather. So you need lots of time there to amuse yourself or to amuse your fellow passengers. What did you do in Paris? Well, I went round the museums, I looked in the art gallery. What did you do? Well, I went to some very interesting lectures. Wow, there's guys over there doing incredible things.
Well, I'd imagine Jackson probably gave a lecture to a group of people. Possibly.
It's not very clear in the reports.
Yeah.
In fact, in one report, he didn't actually have an electromagnet. He just described one. But it depends. It depends which one you read.
Sure.
Anyway,
We give you a poetic license.
these are two people. One scientific, committed to electricity, magnetism, and here's another, a portrait painter.
Rubbish. He was scientific as well.
He wasn't scientific.
He studied maths. He studied religious philosophy. And
that's mighty when you're making an electromagnet.
And equine science. Okay. So the maths, you'd imagine he would have gone to lectures on electricity while at Yale. While at Yale, he's supporting himself through his portrait painting.
Magnetism hadn't even been associated with electricity when he went to Yale.
Sure, but nonetheless, there's that science edge. And even to talk about electricity, later we'll talk about Congress and how they described it all as mesmerism. I mean, there's a reason electricity had been this side fringe.
Well, there've been magical properties associated with it. You could comb your hair at night and get sparks flying up from the comb.
Yeah, but you couldn't.
Could rub a piece of amber on a piece of cloth and pick up little bits of paper with it.
So this is all really, really fresh and really new.
It is, absolutely. And don't forget, information in those days being disseminated was one hell of a lot slower than it is today. Because, for example, it could take 2 weeks to get a message from Europe to America.
Sure. But don't forget the two of them have gone to Ivy League schools, one to Harvard Medical School, one to Yale. So you'd imagine there's a small nucleus of highly educated people in the States, and they're part of that group. So you'd imagine information would flow fairly rapidly.
Yes, but a lot of these people weren't interested in things like magnetism and electricity.
Yeah.
It didn't have a big intellectual following.
Sure. So let's jump to 1831. These two guys are on a ship returning from Europe. So Morse has a bunch of days on a boat to turn this electromagnet into a method of communication.
Don't grab the electromagnetic bit too quickly.
Okay.
Jackson talked with Morse about sending information down a line and getting a visual record of it at the other side.
Okay. What do you mean by that?
I mean, can you use electricity to mark a paper? Can you chemically treat a piece of paper and then have an electric spark leave an imprint on it?
Yeah.
You see, the original idea in the telegraph was send the information, get a record at the other side, and then somebody would read it or interpret it.
Sure.
It didn't actually turn out that way because, as you'll see in a few minutes, when you send Morse, at the receiving end, you start getting taps, dots and dashes, and the good operator can write down the English of that straight away.
Okay.
So the debate rages on between Jackson and Morse. What did Jackson tell Morse? What did Morse think Jackson told him?
But I mean, this only comes much later when...
Oh, much later, yeah.
He's already a success.
So I say Morse was absolutely enthralled by this, the idea of a telegraph, and he spent the rest of the voyage racking his brains, presumably also talking to Jackson, and coming up with schemes for a telegraph.
Which is... It's interesting that 6 years earlier his wife had died while he was painting the Marquis de Lafayette in New York. So his home was in New Haven up north. And apparently he's setting up his studio to paint the Marquis de Lafayette, a massive hero of his. And a messenger arrives with a message saying, your wife is in convulsion, or your wife is suffering convulsions. So they had 2 children together already and the third on the way. So he apparently races home by horseback day and night. And when he arrives, his wife is already buried. So I looked up the maps of the day, and apparently travel times, that might make sense if the messenger took 2-3 days to get to him, and it took 2-3 days for Morse to ride home to New Haven. It could well have, 6 days could well have passed. So it's interesting that 6 years later then he's completely enthralled by a method of communication that would be instantaneous.
Who knows, Who knows what gets people's interest?
Sure.
Anyway, to get back to the electromagnets, this one here is probably about 100 years old, maybe a little bit more. Now, if we had one from Morse's day, we'd be talking more like 190, 200 years ago.
And how is it different to this one here?
Well, I mean, look, this is a DIY one I put together earlier. This one here has got cotton-covered wire. In those days, they insulated by winding cotton or silk, 2 layers of it around the wire to insulate it. And then very carefully wind it over soft iron core, and you have an electromagnet again. So what I'm going to do now is we have a battery.
1 second there.
I have the Morse key, which is essentially a switch, and I'm going to close the switch. Now I took the liberty of putting a little spring on this using an existing hole because I didn't want to make any marks on it. So what I'd like to do now is to replicate, if possible, the original message that was sent.
So just a moment, just to go into the construction of this. I mean, you've cotton covered wire, that's your insulator.
Yeah, the cotton is the insulator. They sometimes use silk.
Wow. Silk from China.
You didn't buy things in those days, you had them made.
Yeah.
You didn't pop out to Maplin or Farnell or whatever, or look online. You had to get in a tradesman and say, please, will you do me some copper wire, and I want you to wind it with silk or cotton, whatever.
So this is this. And what about the key? Is there a story behind it?
You go back 100 years.
Yeah.
And you get a professional to do it.
Okay.
You've got this.
Brilliant. And then the key itself, what's the story behind that?
The key, this one here actually is a replica based on a much earlier one, but a very fine piece of work. Lots of little adjustments on it for adjusting holding the wires in. And of course, Morse sending is all about rhythm. So they were very careful that there are lots of controls on here to adjust the amount of travel you got when you pushed the little key there. You know, you can work out the particular rhythm. And I believe that an operator listening to Morse coming in could actually identify the guy who was sending it. The actual quotation is from the first message is, "What hath God wrought?" In other words, what has God done or made? And what I'd like to do now is to put my glasses on so I can see this and try and replicate the sound that would have been received at the other end of the line. Okay, so we start off with W. It goes dot dash dash H A dot dash T dash again H A dot dash T another H G dash dash dot O D dash dot dot W dot dash dash R dot dash dot O again U dot dot dash G dash dash dot H again and finally T. So it would have sounded something like that at the receiving end. So the message was, "What hath God wrought?"
And then they threw the money at him. Oh, sorry, this was the first message sent after Congress had passed the bill approving him $30,000.
He got $30,000, as I said already on the slides, to build an experimental, if you like, station from Washington to Baltimore. Probably about, 40 miles-ish. And on the outcome of that, they might decide to go a bit further or not. He started out thinking, put the cable underground. So they start digging trenches and put pipes down. And during that time, Mr. Cornell found out about these guys trying to dig these trenches. And he said, no, that's not the way to do it. I'll design you a machine that will dig a trench, put the cable down and backfill as I go along. Because I think he was involved with agricultural machinery. Now he's the same gentleman who set up Cornell University. So he's obviously a fairly shrewd and smart cookie. Unfortunately, putting the cables underground didn't actually physically work. They had an electrical problem. They couldn't get the current to go through. So, redesign, up in the air, lads, start putting poles down, some glass insulators, and one overhead wire. The interesting thing about the telegraph is you need one wire only because you can actually use the earth as return. So
we haven't.
It worked.
So we haven't touched on the fact that Morse was a dirty racist and a religious bigot, but that's
Morse was a pretty unsavory character, according to reports.
Yeah,
he was certainly xenophobic, and apparently a fairly vigorous religious bigot.
I think he didn't want the US muddied
He
by the influx of Catholic
he
immigrants
was-
from Catholic countries.
Well, this is it, you know. And I mean, he was dabbling in politics. You could see when that vote was going through the Senate, a senator came to advise him to go home, that it wasn't going to go through. That senator was a friend of his.
Yeah.
Also, don't forget that the young lady, Miss Ellsworth, was the daughter of the Commissioner for Patents. Now, can I make one point about patents? You can't patent an idea. You can only patent a technique. So this is where a lot of people become a cropper.